who plows the way. Amen. Naaman, the guy that we're talking about in these grand reversals. So ever since the beginning of Advent, I made a promise. And since you're sitting up here too, together we made a promise. We both have to back it. That we're going to keep in your minds. The biggest thing that you regret, that recurring nag, that thing that God keeps tapping you on the shoulder about and says, just leave that alone. Stop touching that. Stop doing that. Stop going there. Stop messing with. Stop going down that path. Stop turning that direction. Whatever that is. God is calling us, specifically, each of us, away from that. Today, we're looking at a guy that God did as a grand reversal. Because with God, the grand reversal, the other path, the walking with him, the leaning toward him instead of whatever that is always better. Not just forever, but even in this world. So these grand reversals are upgrades. The wonderful switcheroos that God pulls is never a settling. It is never a less than. Never a falling down. It is never a missing out. It is never a lost opportunity. It is always a drawing up. For Naaman, he wasn't even a Christian. Now, in the Old Testament, there were lots of Christians. In the New Testament, now, Christians are people who look back to when Jesus was born and when Jesus will come back on the last day. In the Old Testament, true believers were also Christians because they knew that the Christ, the Savior, would be born. And so they were looking for when he would come to die on the cross, to take away all of our sins, come back from the dead, and when he would come back. The only difference is we know more of the promises. Naaman was not one of those. Naaman, as you saw in this text, believed Ramon. He believed in a fake God, a fake God of the thunders and the storms and the weather, just like Thor in the Marvel universe or in the Norwegian fake gods. And he was a mighty God. And Naaman had every reason to be thankful to what he thought was taking care of him, this fake God Ramon, because he was on top of his game. He was powerful. He was in charge of one of the biggest militaries in the area. He not only protected his borders, but he was in charge of the people who went across their borders and murdered and raped and pillaged and stole anything that they wanted and enslaved whoever they wanted and brought them back, including the children that he himself personally oversaw the raping and stealing and enslaving of. He had it all. And I suspect that's why he ended up as a leper. Nobody could just walk up to Naaman on their own volition. Nobody could just bump into him at the store. Nobody could just walk into his office. Nobody could just knock on his door and say, got a few minutes? Because he wasn't just a boss. He was the boss of the military, and he only answered to one person, the king of Syria. And that king of Syria wanted Naaman only fighting wars and not distracted with anything else. And I suspect that's why Naaman got leprosy. I'm not going to go into too many details because we do have a few younger ears here, but very powerful people sometimes have very dark secrets, and they use their power to have very inappropriate relationships and recreational activities. And I think that's how leprosy got into his bedroom. He made very bad decisions, and he ended up with what then was a hopeless disease. Leprosy is an infection being cleared up with antibiotics now, right? So it's no longer a thing. But even up to 100 years ago, if you got leprosy, you were going to have it until it slowly killed you. You would start off with sores, and then people would recognize what they are, and they'd want nothing to do with you because it was incurable and it was terrible. You start off with sores that could not heal, and then those sores would get infected. And if you got a sore on your body, it would hurt and it would get gross and infected. But if you had sores on your fingers, they would get very infected. And on your toes, they would get very infected. And other places of your body that do not have fantastic circulation, like cartilage parts of your body, and they would not get enough blood to stay on. So they would fall off. So when you're waving to people in Hawaii and you're like, aloha, there would be times when you would not have a choice. This would be your wave. Or maybe it would be like that. or just your nose would fall off, your ears would fall off. How long can you hide a secret like that? Naaman was so good on the battlefield. Everybody in the ancient world knew, if you got leprosy, you're out of town. You're out, that's it. Go die in the wilderness, be by yourself. You are a losing horse. You will never get better. You will only get worse, and we don't want what you have. Naaman must have been incredible as a commander because he was kept. He found himself in a hopeless situation, and he wasn't even in the family. He should have been as important to God as that homeless person by the red light that you drive by from time to time, and you look at that person and you think, I could help them, but it'll only go to more booze or whatever. And you have no problem just overlooking them or ignoring them. Or the starving kids on these Christmas commercials, oh, send $50 to Africa and you'll save everybody there. Everybody will get a McDonald's if you just send $50 to Africa, and we'll give you a postcard every month. And it's easy to ignore those because they're not us. They're not our kids, they're not our friends, they're not our neighbors. I ignore this commercial, and it'll be over, and I'll get right back to whatever show I was watching. God should not have cared about Naaman. God should have said, look at Naaman. Don't be like him. Don't worship Ramon. Don't have his recreational activities. Don't live outside of Israel. Don't cheer for the wrong team. Don't be a Cubs fan. He could have made him an amazing example. But look at how God plows the way to get to Naaman. God plowed the way to get to Naaman because Naaman had enslaved a kid among all the other people that he had enslaved. He enslaved a kid. How heartless, how soulless, how completely black and dark inside must you be to have a kid as a slave? And he stole this kid. And God told this kid to care about her slave owner. If I was her and I knew that my master could be healed or he could die a slow, suffering death, if I was enslaved, I think I would consider not telling him. Especially when I get beat because I don't clean the pots well enough or I don't entertain him enough. But God plowed the way. He gave her a heart of love and forgiveness and mercy. And she said, did you know that there's a prophet who could heal this? And then whoever told that message from her to him passed along that message. So he goes to his king and says, can I go to the king of a different country, an enemy country, and ask a prophet of an enemy God to come help me? And God softened that king's heart. Look at all the doors that God is opening. And this isn't even one of his kids. So he goes to Israel and he goes to the king. He was a bad king at the time. And he says, hey, I'm here to get healed. One of your prophets can do this. And the king says, look at this. This guy thinks that I can heal leprosy. He tears his robes. The king and the prophet weren't talking at that time because the king was doing his own dark stuff. So instead of the king referring him, he's basically saying, I can't heal your leprosy, and it couldn't happen to a better person. Go away. Because this is a commander who is personally responsible for attacking Israel. So he's going to send him away. But God plows the way. He gets somebody else to report that message. It comes back from Elisha, the head prophet at that time. And he says, God has a space for you. Look at how God plowed the way. And it's not even one of his kids. So then he goes and he hears Elisha, and Elisha doesn't even come out. He sends a messenger. You don't delegate when Naaman comes to town. But Elisha did. But God plowed the way through Naaman's sense of dignity and what he deserved. So then he gets the message. Go wash in the River Jordan. And Adler read those texts so well. And Naaman goes, aren't my rivers better? My rivers flow from the will of the God of Ramon himself. So he decides to go home, ignores the advice, but God plows the way. He plows the way through his sense of we're better and you're a loser. He plows the way by one of his own servants who doesn't follow Yahweh to come to Naaman and say, look, all you have to do is just splash around in this water 7 times. If it doesn't work, you'll be wet and we'll dry you. If it does work, and Naaman could have said, how dare you tell me that I haven't thought everything through? Your life is now forfeit. But he didn't. God plowed the way. And Naaman wasn't even one of his kids. So Naaman goes back. He washes in the Jordan River 7 times, and his skin is perfectly without any blemish. How many of you know that you have less than perfect skin? If I got to fly to Israel and splash around in that water 7 times to undo 15 years of acne when I was a teenager, holy smokes, I would. Would you like to come with? And then when Naaman goes back and he goes, hey, look, I want a business transaction. You did something good for me. Let me give you this. And he's writing your bulletin, the $6 million gift. And Elisha, through a servant, goes, no, thank you. It's just grace. And that's when Naaman's heart grew 3 sizes that day. He goes, I got to go back to my country. And Ramon is the God of our country. But now I know he's not a real God, or at least cannot help. Can I please be one of you? And so he gets 2 sackfuls of dirt, so that way he can put it there, and he can be on Israel dirt. And there's nothing magical about it, but he's trying to figure this stuff out. They didn't even have Wikipedia back then. That's how dumb these people were. But this dirt would be set up to where he would kneel so he could pray to Yahweh instead. God plowed the way to bring him in. And he wasn't even one of his kids. To Naaman, he had made bad decisions that got him in this leprosy situation, and it was hopeless. You've made bad decisions that put you in a hopeless situation. Now, yes, when Jesus comes back and we're all in paradise, you'll not be suffering the consequences of those bad decisions. You will not have those scars emotionally or physically in your relationships. The people who make it, we will have perfect harmony and everything will be fine. Just like Naaman, if he was brought into the kingdom in a different way, his leprosy would not stick around with him there. But my message to you today is God's healing for us is not just after we die. God's healing for us, his care for us, his involvement for us is not just after paradise starts. To Naaman, he was in a hopeless situation because he could not see everything. But to God, it was always hopeful. To God, Naaman was always clean. To God, Naaman was always healed. To God, Naaman was only on a temporary sickness that he knew the whole time he was going to fix. But from Naaman's perspective, it was hopeless, which taught him to trust in God so much more, which taught him to treasure God so much more. And Naaman wasn't even one of God's kids. Naaman would have never accepted an invitation to come to church. Naaman would have never driven himself to church. You did. If God's going to shower that incredible amount of love and involvement on someone who wouldn't do any of that, did everything wrong, taught people to worship a fake God Ramon, how much more precious and treasured are you? Now, God could not get through to Naaman without allowing him to go through this hopeless situation. When we go through hopeless feeling situations, even then, God is at work. In fact, when we are in seemingly hopeless situations, God does his finest work. Think about Joseph. His wife is pregnant. It's not even his kid. Kind of everybody knows it because she's pregnant before they start being together. Everybody knows it. So all he wants to do is just hang out in Nazareth and just kind of bump along and just kind of fly under the radar. And then his wife starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, not because it's the holidays, because she's pregnant. Bigger and bigger and bigger, too soon, I understand. Bigger and bigger and bigger. And then he gets a note from the tax officials. Hey, guess what? Everybody's got to go home. So now he's got to go hundreds of miles with a pregnant woman. Where are you going to find pickles and ice cream on the walk from Nazareth to Bethlehem when she has the urge? He just wanted to be fine. But God had a bigger plan. He probably thought, I don't know how we're going to get there. I don't know who we're going to stay with. There's a reason he didn't live with his family. There's a reason he didn't live in his hometown. He probably didn't get along with anybody. And I guarantee you he didn't get along with anybody, because when he shows up with his pregnant wife, nobody has an extra room. Nobody in his hometown says, you know what, you're my second cousin. Come on, you can stay with me. So he's leaving normal for a hopeless situation for who knows how long. And by doing that, Jesus fulfilled an unlikely prophecy. And then when Herod says, we're going to kill all the babies, Joseph has to go to another country. What would it take for you to have to move down for months or years to Mexico? Like backwoods hill country Mexico, run by the cartels. That's what it's like to leave Israel to go to Egypt at that time. And then when God says, hey, it's time to come back, you don't know if it's safe. And that allowed Jesus to fulfill another prophecy and to be born in the hill country of Israel. So he would include all the rednecks and the hicks that everybody else looked down on. Think of how hopeless it was when Jesus rode into Jerusalem and the crowd start to turn. Think of how hopeless it was when Jesus was going to the cross, carrying his own cross, bleeding out his own back. He couldn't even carry the weight of the cross himself. They had to get another guy. Think of how hopeless it was to watch him die for 6 hours. Think of how hopeless it was to take down the body and lay it in a hole and have to walk away and think it was over. God does some of his best work when it seems hopeless. God does some of his best work when it seems hopeless because of decisions that we have made. And God will use even those moments to change us in a wonderful way. Naaman, I guarantee you, before he died, got to the point that he could thank God for his leprosy. You might be in a hopeless situation right now. If you live any much longer in this world, you'll be in hopeless situations over and over again. But you are never Christless. You are never Godless. You are truly never without hope. Because just like Naaman, God is with you. Naaman wasn't even one of his kids. You are. Your situation is, and always will be even more hopeful. Because you are one of his kids. You may not be in the point where you can thank God for that hopeless situation, but you will be. Because you are one of his kids. At the end of every one of our conversations, we give each other a little bit of space to have our own conversations with God. This is your time. This is your moment. This is your moment with God.